New York City, 1907. The streets that once buzzed with American optimism now echoed with whispers of despair. Endless lines formed outside banks not to deposit, but to desperately withdraw what remained of a lifetime's work. The American dream hadn't just cracked, it had crumbled before the eyes of millions. It isn't just another story about money. It's about how fear can be transformed into power, how chaos can breed control, and how a crisis that nearly destroyed a nation ended up creating the most powerful financial system the world has ever known. Picture this for a moment. You wake up one October morning to discover that the bank where you kept your life savings simply no longer exists. Its doors are shuttered, its employees vanished, and everything you worked for has evaporated like smoke. This was the nightmare lived by countless Americans at the dawn of the 20th century. But while ordinary families lost everything, some men saw opportunity where others saw only ruin. In dimly lit rooms around mahogany tables, a financial elite began weaving the threads of a new kind of power, a power that didn't depend on armies or territories, but on numbers, influence, and most importantly, the ability to control fear itself. Wall Street, until then just a narrow street in lower Manhattan, was about to transform into the epicenter of global capitalism. But how? How did a handful of men manage to turn the greatest financial collapse in American history into their greatest victory? The answer lies in the shadows of that turbulent era, where the line between salvation and domination became dangerously thin. This is the untold story of how from absolute ruin was born the most powerful rule the world has ever known. Get ready to discover how Wall Street stopped being just an address and became synonymous with global power. This is the story of how panic became profit, how crisis became control, and how the masters of money learned to turn disaster into dominance. From ruin to rule, this is Wall Street's untold story. To understand how Wall Street conquered the world, we must first return to the golden years that preceded the storm. The dawn of the 20th century breathed prosperity. America was emerging as an industrial powerhouse, railroads cut across the continent, and a new middle class was discovering the pleasures of investment. It was an era of unbridled optimism. Newspapers proclaimed that poverty would be eradicated within a generation. Factory workers left their jobs to become speculators. Housewives discussed stocks at the grocery store like they were sharing recipes. The financial markets were no longer the exclusive playground of the wealthy, they had become America's common ground. But there was one problem. Nobody really understood the rules of the game. Banks sprouted overnight, promising impossible returns. Phantom companies sold shares in projects that existed only on paper. Speculation became a national fever. Trusts and cartels manipulated prices without any oversight. It was the Wild West of financial markets, uncharted territories where anyone could make a fortune, but few understood the risks. The American financial system was a giant house of cards. There was no central bank, no significant federal regulation, and confidence was based more on faith than solid fundamentals. Each bank operated virtually as an independent kingdom, with its own rules and questionable reserves. The common citizen, seduced by promises of quick riches, began betting life savings on schemes they could barely comprehend. Railroad workers bought shares in gold mines they'd never seen. Small merchants invested in sugar trusts that promised astronomical profits. It was the democratization of speculation, and it was about to become a catastrophe. Behind this euphoria, a more experienced financial elite watched with growing concern. Men like J.P. Morgan saw alarming signs: dangerously low bank reserves, rampant speculative lending, and an interconnection of risks that could topple the entire system like dominoes. But their warnings were drowned out by the noise of money-printing machines. After all, why worry about risks when everyone was getting rich? The banking system was built on a foundation of mutual trust and informal agreements. When times were good, this worked beautifully. But it created a fatal vulnerability. If confidence evaporated, the entire structure could collapse in hours. There was no safety net, no lender of last resort, no systematic way to contain panic once it began. The irony is devastating. Just when more Americans had access to the dream of prosperity than ever before, the system supporting that dream was more fragile than it had ever been. It was like a sumptuous party being held on thin ice, wonderful until the moment the floor gave way. And in 1907, the floor finally gave way. The stage was set for the greatest financial collapse in American history, a collapse that would destroy millions of lives, but would also create the opportunity for a small group of men to seize control of the nation's economic destiny. It all began with a whisper. In October 1907, rumors about problems at the Knickerbocker Trust Company started circulating through the corridors of Wall Street. Just rumors, nothing more. But in the fragile house of cards that was the American financial system, whispers could cause avalanches. The next morning, the first line formed. 10 people, then 50, then hundreds. Word spread like wildfire, the Knickerbockers failing. It didn't matter whether it was true or false in the world of finance. Perception is reality. Within hours, what began as suspicion turned into total panic. Thousands of depositors crowded outside the bank's doors, demanding their deposits back. Women cried in the street, clutching their savings books. Men fought for positions in line. Children watched, unable to understand why their parents were so desperate. The Knickerbocker couldn't honor the withdrawals. Its doors closed at noon, sealing the fate of thousands of families. But this was just the beginning. The panic spread like a financial plague. If the Knickerbocker could fail, any bank could fail. Within 2 days, bank runs multiplied throughout New York. The Trust Company of America was next to fall, then Lincoln Trust. Each closure fed more terror, more desperation, more bank runs. The scenes in the streets were apocalyptic. People who woke up rich went to bed poor. Entire families lost generations of savings in a matter of hours. Respected men found themselves ruined overnight. Suicide, tragically, became a daily statistic in the newspapers. But the human tragedy was just the tip of the iceberg. The banking collapse paralyzed commerce. Companies couldn't access credit. Wages went unpaid. The stock exchange plummeted, taking with it the last remnants of confidence in the system. Wall Street, which just days before had symbolized the triumph of American capitalism, now looked like a battlefield. Brokers walked like zombies among the wreckage of their dreams. Luxurious offices emptied as century-old firms simply disappeared. President Theodore Roosevelt watched from Washington as the nation he led threatened to disintegrate economically. The country that prided itself on its independence and strength discovered it was completely vulnerable to the fluctuations of a market that few truly understood. The crisis revealed a terrifying truth about the American economy. It was entirely dependent on confidence. And confidence, once lost, was nearly impossible to restore. Banks that had seemed solid for decades were revealed to be built on quicksand. Investments that had seemed safe turned out to be pure speculation. In 2 weeks, the United States went from emerging power to emergency case. Confidence in the financial system wasn't just shaken, it was dead. The economy was in free fall, and there seemed to be no bottom. And it was in this moment of absolute despair that some men saw not a catastrophe, but an opportunity. While the nation panicked, they prepared to act. While Manhattan sank into financial chaos, an imposing figure walked calmly through the streets of Wall Street. John Pierpont, Morgan J.P. to his intimates, showed neither panic nor despair. At 70 years old, he had navigated enough crises to know that moments of terror were, paradoxically, moments of opportunity. On the afternoon of October 24, 1907, Morgan convened a meeting that would forever change the course of American financial history. It wasn't held in Congress, it wasn't in the White House, but in his private library on East 36th Street. There, among shelves filled with rare manuscripts and priceless works of art, the true owners of American power gathered. Present were the names that defined capitalism of the era: George Baker of First National Bank, James Stillman of National City Bank, Jacob Schiff of Kuhn, Loeb & Co. These men controlled more capital than some entire countries. And now, with the federal government virtually powerless, they were the only force capable of saving or redefining the system. Morgan naturally assumed control of the situation. With his imposing presence and characteristic mustache, he transformed his library into an economic war headquarters. Financial maps replaced artwork on the walls. Telegraphs worked incessantly, connecting that room with banks across the country. The strategy was audacious and risky. They themselves would provide the liquidity the system desperately needed, but not for free and not without conditions. Every bank saved would have to accept new oversight. Every company rescued would have to cede control. It was free market capitalism, but with new masters. In 48 frantic hours, Morgan and his inner circle moved mountains of money. $25 million were injected into the Trust Company of America. Other banks received emergency credit lines. The stock exchange, which threatened to collapse completely, was stabilized through coordinated purchases. But the most impressive thing wasn't the money they invested, it was the confidence they restored. When J.P. Morgan publicly declared that a bank was sound, that declaration was worth more than any government audit. His word had become more powerful than the word of the president himself. The federal government watched, powerless and grateful, as private men saved the nation. Roosevelt, the president who prided himself on speaking softly and carrying a big stick, discovered that in the modern economy, the big stick belonged to Wall Street. Morgan's library became the unofficial capital of America. Decisions made in that room affected millions of lives. The future of companies, the fate of banks, the direction of the entire economy, all were decided by a small group of men who answered to no voters. Number constitution, no authority except their own judgment. In 1 week, the crisis was contained. Banks reopened, panic subsided, and the American economy breathed again. But something fundamental had changed. Real power no longer resided in Washington, but in a private library in Manhattan. The masters of money hadn't just saved the system, they had become the system. With the crisis controlled came the most delicate moment, rebuilding a financial system that had collapsed like a house of cards. But this time, the architects would be different. Wall Street didn't just help put out the fire. Now it was designing the new city that would rise from the ashes. J.P. Morgan and his allies wasted no time. While the country was still recovering from trauma, they were already implementing structural changes that would consolidate their power for decades. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Centralize what was dispersed, organize what was chaotic, and control what was uncontrolled. The first step was creating coordination mechanisms between banks. Before the crisis, each financial institution operated in isolation, like medieval fiefdoms. Morgan established communication networks, emergency protocols, and most importantly, command hierarchies. Wall Street began functioning not as a collection of competing companies, but as a single organism. Simultaneously, they rewrote the rules of the financial game. New reserve standards were established not by federal law, but by private agreement among major institutions. Riskier speculative practices were discouraged through peer pressure. The market began to self-regulate, but under the discreet supervision of the new masters, the consolidation was breathtaking. Smaller banks that survived the crisis discovered that their survival depended on alignment with the big players. Mergers and acquisitions multiplied, concentrating even more power in the hands of the few. Within 2 years, the American financial system had become more centralized than many European monarchies. But the true genius of the strategy lay in public perception. Morgan and his associates positioned themselves not as conquerors, but as saviors. They didn't seize power, they assumed responsibility. They didn't seek profit, they sought stability. At least that's how the story was being told. The press, relieved by the end of the crisis, celebrated these men as national heroes. The saviors of America blazed the headlines. Glowing biographies described Morgan as a financial statesman, a patriot who sacrificed personal interests for the common good. What was rarely mentioned was how this salvation redistributed power and wealth. Companies that were rescued had to accept new majority shareholders. Banks that received help discovered that their decisions now required external approval. The price of stability was independence. The transformation was systematic and thorough. Financial information that had once been scattered among hundreds of institutions now flowed through centralized channels. Credit decisions that had once been made locally were now subject to approval from New York. The entire rhythm of American commerce began to beat in time with Wall Street's pulse. Less than 3 years after the crisis, Wall Street had transformed from financial district to command center of the American economy. What began as an emergency rescue operation had become a silent revolution in the distribution of economic power. The reconstruction was complete, and when the dust settled, it was discovered that the architects of the new system were also its primary beneficiaries. The saviors had become the rulers. The bill for salvation arrived, and as always happens, it wasn't paid by those who ordered it. While Wall Street celebrated its new position of power, the rest of America discovered the true cost of financial stability. For the common citizen, the changes were immediate and painful. Credit, once abundant and accessible, became scarce and expensive. The same banks that had begged for salvation now demanded impossible guarantees for basic loans. Small merchants who depended on seasonal credit watched their businesses wither. Families who lost savings in the crisis discovered that rebuilding them would be much harder than they imagined. Banking concentration created financial deserts in smaller communities. Local banks, absorbed by larger institutions, closed branches in small towns. Personal service based on relationships and local knowledge was replaced by cold, distant evaluations made in Manhattan offices. But the real losers were the workers. The stabilization of the financial system came accompanied by a wave of economic rationalization. Companies that were restructured cut costs aggressively. Wages were reduced under the justification of hard times. Working hours increased while labor rights diminished. Ironically, while the country as a whole paid the price of recovery, a specific elite prospered like never before. The tycoons who saved America discovered that national gratitude was extraordinarily profitable. Morgan consolidated his control over railroads, steel mills, and banks. Other members of his circle expanded empires in strategic sectors. Wealth concentration reached historic levels. By 1910, less than 1% of the population controlled more than 40% of national wealth. Wall Street had created the first truly modern plutocracy in history, an elite that exercised power not through noble titles or land, but through absolute control over financial flows. The most impressive thing was how this redistribution of power was presented as collective victory. The press spoke of a new era of American prosperity. Politicians celebrated the nation's financial maturity. Academics wrote about the natural evolution of capitalism. The official narrative transformed power concentration into national progress. Protests existed but were marginalized. Unions that questioned the new economic rules were labeled unpatriotic. Politicians who defended greater financial regulation lost campaign funding. Critical journalists discovered that their publications depended on advertising from companies, controlled by the same men they criticized. A new order had been established: stability in exchange for submission, aggregate prosperity in exchange for individual concentration, national security in exchange for private control. The worst part was that it worked. The economy stabilized, investments returned, and America resumed its growth. Success justified the methods, and the methods consolidated success. The American people had made a devil's bargain without realizing it. They traded democracy for stability, competition for consolidation, and distributed power for concentrated control. And because the economy grew and life improved for many, few questioned whether the price was worth paying. Wall Street had learned the most important lesson of power. It's not necessary to break the system to control it. Sometimes saving it is enough. The crisis had ended, but its lessons should have echoed for generations. At least that's what politicians promised in fiery speeches about reform and renewal. Never again, they thundered from podiums, will we allow reckless speculation to threaten the welfare of the American people. The promises were grandiose. Theodore Roosevelt, still president, promised an era of rigorous financial oversight. Commissions were formed to investigate the causes of the crisis. Voluminous reports were produced, documenting in detail the excesses that nearly destroyed the country. Reform seemed inevitable, but promising is one thing, implementing is something else entirely. The first signs that the reforms would be more theater than substance appeared quickly. Congressional investigations, initially aggressive, gradually lost steam. Key witnesses developed conveniently poor memories. Crucial documents mysteriously disappeared, and investigators discovered that their own political careers depended on the goodwill of the same men they were investigating. J.P. Morgan, summoned to testify before a congressional commission, turned his hearing into a masterful demonstration of power. Dressed impeccably with the air of a benevolent patriarch, he politely explained how he had served the country during the crisis. When questioned about financial power concentration, he responded with disarming candor, "I cannot help it if others depend on my judgment." The audience left convinced they had witnessed not a monopolist, but a statesman. Bills that promised serious regulation arrived in Congress with full force and left as caricatures of themselves. Crucial clauses were removed and technical adjustments. Deadlines were postponed indefinitely. Budgets for oversight were cut due to austerity needs. What really happened was a masterclass in political influence. Wall Street had learned that it was much more efficient to shape regulation than to fight it openly. Why battle against the rules when you can write the rules? Elite lawyers circulated between public positions and private offices with impressive ease. Today they regulated banks and government. Tomorrow they worked for those same banks in the private sector. The lines between supervisors and supervised became so blurred they practically disappeared. The public, exhausted by economic turbulence and relieved by return stability, gradually lost interest in complex reforms. Financial matters were too technical for the common citizen. It was better to let experts handle these affairs. The revolving door between Wall Street and Washington became institutionalized. Regulators who were tough on banks found their career prospects limited. Those who were reasonable discovered lucrative opportunities in the private sector. The incentive structure ensured that serious oversight would remain rare. Within 5 years, the lessons of the 1907 crisis were carefully filed away and forgotten. Promised reforms became footnotes in history books. And the same patterns that caused the original crisis, excessive speculation, risk concentration, lack of real oversight, began to resurface. America had learned a lesson, but not the right lesson. It learned that crises could be survived, not that they could be prevented. It learned that systems could be saved, not that they could be reformed. And Wall Street smiled, knowing that the next crisis would be just another opportunity. By 1913, just 6 years after nearly collapsing along with the rest of the country, Wall Street had achieved something unprecedented in history, transforming a devastating defeat into the most complete victory the financial world had ever known. The creation of the Federal Reserve that year was sold to the public as the great reform that would finally place the financial system under democratic control. Never again will private bankers hold the nation's destiny, promised politicians. But reality was more subtle and much more clever. The Fed, as it became known, was formerly a public institution, but its structure, its policies, and its leadership were carefully molded by the same men who had saved the country in 1907. J.P. Morgan may not have officially become America's central banker, but his protégés and allies occupied key positions in the new system. It was the perfect coup. Wall Street had gotten the federal government to officialize and legitimize its position of power. What had once been informal influence now had the force of law. What had once depended on private consensus now had public authority. But the real triumph was global. World War I, which erupted shortly after the Fed's creation, transformed the United States into the world's banker. European countries, devastated by conflict, needed American credit for reconstruction. Wall Street, with its new semi-official status and consolidated resources, became the mandatory intermediary for these financial flows. London, for centuries the world's financial center, yielded space to New York. The pound sterling, the international reference currency, began competing with the American dollar. And at the heart of this transformation was Wall Street, no longer just a street with banks, but the epicenter of global economic power. The numbers tell the story. In 1900, the United States owed money to the world. By 1920, the world owed money to the United States. And whoever controlled these credit flows controlled much more than money. They controlled foreign policy, economic development, and national destinies. Wall Street had discovered the secret of modern power. It wasn't necessary to conquer territories when you could conquer trade balances. Why occupy countries when you could finance them? Why impose governments when you could influence economic policies? The 1907 crisis had taught a fundamental lesson in a modern capitalist world. Whoever controls capital flow controls everything. And Wall Street had positioned itself as the supreme controller of these flows. What began as a street of local banks had become the central nervous system of global capitalism. The ruin of 1907 wasn't the end of an era, it was the beginning of the American era. And at the heart of this new era was Wall Street, no longer serving the economy, but making the economy serve it. The transformation was complete and irreversible. Wall Street had evolved from a local financial district into a global power that rivaled nations. The masters of money had become the masters of the modern world. From ruin had been born not just recovery, but rule. And that rule would spread across the entire world. Today, more than a century later, when we look at the glass towers that dominate lower Manhattan, it's hard to imagine that it all began with fear. Absolute fear, total despair, the feeling that the American dream was crumbling before the eyes of an entire nation. But it was precisely that fear that became the foundation of the most enduring power the modern world knows. Wall Street learned that crises don't destroy systems, they reconfigure them, and whoever controls the reconfiguration controls the future. The story of 1907 repeated itself countless times, 1929, 1987, 2008. With each crisis, the same pattern: initial panic, intervention by experts, system stabilization, even greater concentration of power. Like an organism that grows stronger with each trauma, Wall Street transformed each collapse into consolidation. What we've learned is that the real revolution didn't happen with barricades or manifestos, but with spreadsheets and balance sheets. It wasn't kings who were overthrown, but the very notion that economic power could be democratically controlled. Wall Street proved that in a modern economy, whoever controls capital controls everything else: politics, media, education, even our dreams and fears. And it did this not through violent conquest, but through something much more elegant, making itself indispensable. The ruin of 1907 was just the first act of a much longer play. A play where chaos always generates order, where fear always produces submission. and where each crisis is just another opportunity to consolidate control. This is Wall Street's untold story, not just how it survived, but how it transformed its survival into the rule that governs the modern world. From ruin was born the rule, and the rule remains. The masters of money had won the ultimate victory. They had convinced the world that their power was not just necessary, but natural. And in doing so, they had rewritten the very definition of capitalism itself.